The first CEO of Apple isn't a face you've seen in keynote montages. It's not Jobs. It's not Wozniak. It's a quiet engineer named Michael Scotty Scott, a man who helped turn a garage project into a real company, fired 40 people in a single day, and then disappeared from Silicon Valley to stand on a barge at sea, trying to shoot cheap rockets into space. On one side of his life, there's an apple orchard in Oregon where the name Apple Computer finally stuck. On the other, there's a homemade launch platform in the Pacific, holding a hybrid rocket built from rubber and liquid oxidizer. Somewhere between those two images is the real story. Not of a famous founder, but of the man they hired to keep the engines from blowing apart. If Steve Jobs was the captain on the bridge, pointing to future worlds, Michael Scott was the one down in the engine room, doing the work Montgomery Scott did on the Enterprise, watching gauges, rerouting power, and quietly deciding how far this ship could really be pushed before something broke. And like a Star Trek episode that never aired, one day he simply isn't there anymore. He walks off the bridge of one of the most valuable companies in history and into a different kind of launch. Before Apple, Michael M. Scott was not a startup mascot. He was a physics kid who went to Caltech, the kind of person who sees the world in tolerances and tolerable risk. After graduation, he went into the heart of the chip industry, Fairchild Semiconductor, where he shared a cubicle with Mike Markkula. Years later, Markkula would bankroll a tiny computer company called Apple and look around for someone who knew how to run a factory and a balance sheet at the same time. Scott moved from Fairchild to National Semiconductor and rose to director of manufacturing. He was not the guy in the garage soldering. He was the guy who could answer questions like, how many boards can we realistically ship next quarter without killing quality? Where do we put the line if we want 0 typewriters and a lot of product on time? So when Markkula looked at Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, brilliant, young, and completely untested as executives, he made a simple decision. The founders would not run the company, at least not yet. In February 1977, he persuaded Michael Scott to take a risk and become the first CEO of Apple Computer. Inside that little building in Cupertino, Scott inherited a strange mix. A visionary who could bend reality in a meeting, an engineer who could make a computer sing with almost no parts, and a growing crowd of people who just wanted to know if they would get a paycheck on Friday. To them, Scott wasn't a celebrity. He was the person who could decide whether Apple lived or died long enough to have celebrities, and he had a sense of humor about it. When he started assigning employee numbers, he quietly gave himself 7 instead of 5, just so he could be 007. It was a small private joke in a company that didn't yet know it was becoming mythology. In those first years, Apple wasn't a trillion-dollar logo. It was a bet. The Apple II was beginning to sell. The company was racing toward an IPO, and the culture was still closer to a hobbyist club than a corporation. Scott began doing what engineers do when they step into a starship that's barely off the ground. He set rules. One of them became famous. In 1979, he declared there would be no typewriters at Apple. If you were going to work there, you composed on a computer. It wasn't just a quirky rule. It was a line in the sand. Apple would live on the machines it built, or it didn't deserve to build them. He pushed projects that didn't look like sure bets yet. Jeff Raskin's little experimental computer, the Macintosh, was nearly canceled more than once. In at least one reorganization, it actually was canceled on paper. Raskin pleaded for a little more time. Scott and Markkula gave it to him. That extra time is part of why a friendly little box with a smiling face eventually ended up on people's desks. From the outside, Steve Jobs was already becoming the storyteller. Inside the building, day after day, Michael Scott was the one absorbing the friction that comes with growth. Arguments over budgets, factories, deadlines, and the simple fact that your brilliant friends from the garage might not be the best managers of a 100-person team. If Montgomery Scott's job on the Enterprise was to look at a set of impossible orders and say, "She can't take much more of this, Captain," Michael Scott's job at Apple was uncomfortably similar. Keep the engines running. Push them when you must. Don't let the ship tear itself apart while everybody else is staring at the stars. By 1980, Apple was racing toward its stock market debut. The company had hired quickly. In Scott's view, maybe too quickly. Other executives would later describe his fear of something he called a bozo explosion. That if you hire too many people, too fast, you dilute the talent that made the company special in the first place. On a February morning in 1981, he acted. Michael Scott came into work and, one by one, began firing people. About 40 employees were let go, roughly half of the Apple II team. Some were told in minutes that their time at Apple was over. Desks were cleared. Lives were shaken. Inside the company, the date picked up a name: Black Wednesday. Later that day, Scott did something even stranger. He gathered the remaining employees around a keg of beer and tried to explain the cuts. People remember him joking that he'd once said if being CEO stopped being fun, he'd quit. But now, he'd changed his mind. If it stopped being fun, he'd fire people until it's fun again. Some heard gallows humor, others heard a threat. But everybody understood one thing: the ship was changing. Within months, Scott was no longer captain. He was moved out of the CEO role into a vice chairman title with almost no real power. Mike Markkula stepped in. Steve Jobs' influence inside the company continued to grow. By that summer, Michael Scott's resignation letter made it official. The first CEO of Apple was gone. From that day on, Apple's public story would follow its founding captain. Jobs on magazine covers, Jobs on stage, Jobs in the movies. But the man they'd once called Scotty walked down the gangway and didn't come back. Most executives in that position stay in the same orbit. They join another tech firm, another board, another polished office park. Michael Scott went looking for something stranger. In the early 1980s, a small company called Starstruck Inc. was trying to do something wildly ambitious: build low-cost rockets that could be launched from the sea. The idea was to use hybrid propulsion, a solid rubber-like fuel and a liquid oxidizer, to make launches cheaper and safer. Their prototype booster was called Dolphin, and their plan looked less like NASA and more like a science fiction side plot. Tow a launch barge out into the Pacific off the California coast, aim for the sky, and light the fuse. Scott joined Starstruck's leadership and stepped into a very different kind of engine room. Instead of managing supply chains for circuit boards, he was now helping guide a small, underfunded team trying to do real rocketry on a budget. Hybrid engines were tested. Hardware was built. 2 launches were attempted off the coast, both aborted. A third finally pushed a rocket into suborbital space. There were no glossy keynotes for this work. No signature on the back of the rocket. Just salt air, risk, and a lot of engineers doing math over coffee at odd hours. If Apple was about making machines for the rest of us, Starstruck was about getting anyone into orbit who couldn't afford a traditional launch. But the economics were brutal. Starstruck eventually folded. Some of its veterans went on to found the American Rocket Company, AMROC, another attempt to make reusable hybrid propellant rockets. That company, too, would fail, but its patents and ideas would be acquired by SpaceDev, a firm that later merged into the aerospace company Sierra Nevada Corporation, one of many quiet tributaries that now feed today's private space industry. The headline version of that arc is simple: the first Apple CEO disappeared and built rockets. The reality is quieter and stranger. A former CEO walked away from the hottest brand in computing to join a small, struggling company on the water, trying to invent a cheaper way to reach orbit. No podium, no spotlight, just engines and risk. In its own way, it's the most Star Trek thing he ever did. After rockets, Michael Scott's life took another hard turn, this time away from engines entirely. He became obsessed with color, not in pixels but in stones. Scott began collecting colored gemstones. He studied them, cataloged them, and eventually wrote about them. His private collection grew so large and so carefully curated that it was exhibited at the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana, California. When mineralogists wanted high-quality spectral data from well-characterized minerals, Scott helped fund the RRUFF project, a scientific effort to build a complete library of mineral spectra. In the end, the mineral world gave something back. A new mineral discovered in South Africa, a copper barium silicate, was named scottyite in his honor. Another, Rafit, took its name from the project he supported. The man who had tried to keep Apple from exploding, who had stood on a barge with a hybrid rocket aimed at orbit, now had his name crystallized in stone. There's a strange symmetry in that. At Apple, Scott's job was to keep delicate systems stable under pressure. In rocketry, his teams tried to keep combustion pointed in exactly one direction. In mineralogy, he helped map the hidden structures of things that look simple on the surface but are unbelievably complex when you look closer. A rocket plume, a circuit board, a sapphire under polarized light. Different worlds, same instinct. Understand what's happening under the hood. So where does the apple orchard fit into the story of the man who disappeared? Years before Apple's IPO, Steve Jobs was spending time at a commune in Oregon called All One Farm, living on a mostly fruit-based diet and working in its apple orchard. On the drive back from that farm, he suggested the name Apple Computer. It sounded simple, playful, and, as he liked to say, not intimidating. The fruit, the farm, the orchard, they all collapsed into one word that would end up on millions of devices. When Michael Scott walked in the door not long after, that name was already stamped on letterhead. He didn't choose the logo. He didn't come up with the brand. His job was stranger and more thankless. Make sure this thing didn't burn up on re-entry. In Star Trek, Montgomery Scott is never the one giving the grand speeches to the Federation. He's the one answering the same impossible question week after week. Can we go faster? He grumbles. He calculates. He overestimates repair times so he can deliver miracles early. But he always knows what the ship can really handle. Michael Scott's story feels like the real-world version of that archetype, just without the orchestral score. At Apple, he pushed for discipline and lived on the machines they sold. On Black Wednesday, he made decisions that still echo in company lore. At sea, he stood on steel decks under open sky, backing a cheap launch system that history remembers as a failure. But that helped restart interest in hybrid rockets. In museums and mineral databases, his name sits quietly next to stones and spectra. You scroll past headlines about Apple, and you see the same faces over and over. But in the background, there's this other figure. The first CEO, the one who fired people until it was fun again, walked away, and then spent years chasing rockets and light. If Grand Adventures has a soft spot, it's for people like that, the ones who don't look like main characters at first glance. The engineer who takes the captain's chair just long enough to steady the ship. The man whose life keeps drifting toward engines, whether they burn electricity, fuel, or sunlight through cut stone. The orchard is long quiet now. The first Macs he helped shepherd are museum pieces. The rockets he backed are footnotes in aerospace history. The minerals named after him sit under glass. But if you look at the arc as one continuous story, there's a kind of launch sequence hiding in it. Apple. Rockets. Stone. A company that left the garage. A rocket that left the ocean. A name that left the boardroom and ended up inside the Earth itself. Most of us only ever hear about the captain. This is the engineer's episode.